In the summer of 1943, a man sat in a German prison camp in the middle of occupied France and did something that most prisoners of war never even dared to imagine. He stole a plane. Not just any plane. He walked across an active Luftwaffe airfield in broad daylight, climbed into a German fighter, figured out the controls, and flew it out. Alone, into enemy airspace, without a map, without orders, and without anyone's permission except his own. His name was William Ash, but most people who knew him called him Tex. He was 24 years old, born in the hardscrabble hill country of Texas, raised partly in Tennessee, and he had spent his teenage years doing the kind of thing that got you either killed or famous in the American South of the 1930s. Barnstorming, stunt flying, wing walking, the kind of flying that existed entirely outside the rules, where the only authority you answered to was physics and your own nerve. The Germans would spend the rest of the war trying to hold him. They would never quite manage it. This is the story of how a kid from Tennessee became the most determined escape artist in the entire Allied prisoner of war system. A man the Germans moved from camp to camp who spent more time in solitary confinement than almost any prisoner on record, and who, on one extraordinary afternoon in occupied France, simply climbed into a Messerschmitt and flew away. To understand how William Ash ended up in a German prison camp, you have to understand the world he came from and what that world did to young men who were drawn to the sky. He was born in Dallas in 1917 and grew up in the Depression-era South in a family that had very little money and a great deal of stubborn pride. The 1930s were a strange and electrifying time in American aviation. The Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk only 30 years before, and already the aircraft had transformed from a curious wooden contraption into something that could cross oceans and break speed records. But for most ordinary Americans, the airplane was still a kind of miracle, something you paid a quarter to watch at a county fair, not something you climbed into yourself, unless you were a barnstormer. The barnstorming circuit was America's wild edge of aviation, men and women who flew surplus military aircraft from town to town across the rural South and Midwest, offering rides for $1, performing loops and spins and low passes over wheat fields, sometimes walking on the wings while their partner held the stick steady. It was illegal in many of its iterations, dangerous in all of them, and absolutely alive in a way that very little else in Depression America could match. For young men with nothing but sky above them and a hunger for something more than poverty, it was irresistible. Ash found it as a teenager, and it found him. He learned to fly in the informal, entirely unregulated way that barnstormers learned, by watching, by doing, by making mistakes at altitude and correcting them before the ground arrived. He had a gift for it, the kind of instinctive spatial awareness and coolness under pressure that cannot be entirely taught. By the time he was in his late teens, he was performing at small air shows across the region, flying aircraft held together partly by wire and partly by faith. But the 1930s were also the decade when the world began its slow, terrible turn toward war. In Spain, German and Italian aircraft were bombing civilian populations. In China, Japanese fighters were strafing refugee columns. In Germany, the Luftwaffe was rebuilding at a pace that should have alarmed every government in Europe. William Ash read the newspapers, and what he read made him angry in a specific, focused way that barnstorming had sharpened into something useful. He believed, simply and totally, that fascism was wrong and that someone ought to do something about it. In 1940, before the United States had entered the war, he crossed the border into Canada, joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. This was not a small decision. He was giving up American citizenship for the duration of the conflict, subjecting himself to the discipline and hierarchy of a foreign military, and volunteering to fly combat operations over occupied Europe at a time when the life expectancy of a Spitfire pilot could be measured in weeks. He did it anyway. He trained in Canada, was commissioned as a pilot officer, and was posted to Britain in 1941, where he joined the RCAF's 411 Squadron. He flew Spitfires. The Spitfire was designed in the mid-1930s by Reginald Mitchell, who was dying of cancer as he drew it. The result was an aircraft of extraordinary elegance and equally extraordinary lethality, with an elliptical wing design that gave it a turning radius no German pilot could quite match at low altitude, and a Merlin engine that could pull it through maneuvers that stripped the blood from the pilot's brain. Flying one was an act of intimacy. The controls were so responsive that pilots described it as wearing the aircraft rather than sitting in it. For a man trained on the improvisational madness of the barnstorming circuit, it fit like a glove. Ash flew operational sorties over France and the English Channel through 1941 and into 1942. He understood what a machine could do and what it could not do, and he did not waste either understanding. Then, on the 29th of March 1942, over the skies of northern France, his Spitfire was hit. What is known is that Ash was flying at altitude over the Pas-de-Calais region when German flak or fighter fire struck his aircraft. The Merlin engine began to lose power. He had perhaps seconds to decide whether to bail out over enemy territory and become a prisoner or attempt a forced landing that might kill him. He chose the bail out. He went out of the aircraft, pulled his parachute, and came down in occupied France, where he was met by German soldiers before he had even finished collapsing his chute. He was 24 years old, and he was a prisoner of war. What happened next would define the next 3 years of his life and cement his reputation as one of the most relentlessly uncooperative prisoners in the entire German POW system. The Germans ran their prisoner of war system for Allied airmen through a chain of dedicated camps called Luftstalags, administered not by the Army, but by the German Air Force itself. The theory, somewhat gentlemanly in conception, was that captured airmen should be held by fellow aviators who might understand the code of their profession. The reality was that the Luftstalags were still prisons surrounded by wire and guards and watchtowers, and that the men inside them were still stripped of their freedom. Ash arrived first at a transit camp where German intelligence officers made a systematic attempt to extract information from newly captured airmen through a combination of sympathy, false camaraderie, and patient waiting. They offered cigarettes. They offered hot meals. They asked questions that seemed harmless and built toward the ones that were not. Most Allied airmen gave their name, rank, and serial number, and nothing more. Ash was no different, except that his performance was, if anything, more theatrically unhelpful than the average. He was moved to Stalag Luft III, the purpose-built maximum security camp for Allied Air Force officers near the town of Sagan in what is now Western Poland. Most people know Stalag Luft III from one story, the Great Escape of March 1944, in which 76 Allied officers crawled through a tunnel called Harry and emerged into the forest beyond the wire, only to have almost all of them recaptured within days and 50 of them shot on Hitler's direct order. But Stalag Luft III housed hundreds of men long before the Great Escape, and among those men was an entire subculture devoted entirely to getting out. The escape culture of the Luftstalags was extraordinary in its sophistication. There were escape committees that vetted proposed attempts and allocated resources. There were forgers who produced identity documents of remarkable quality using equipment made from stolen or improvised materials. There were tailors who converted RAF uniforms into passable civilian clothing. There were mapmakers who traced routes across occupied Europe by memorizing details from German newspapers and library books. There were intelligence networks that tracked the guards' routines, shifts, and habits. The whole enterprise had the energy and organization of a military operation because, in a very real sense, it was one. The Geneva Convention permitted captured soldiers to attempt escape. The obligation was to try. Ash threw himself into it. He was not the kind of man who sat quietly and waited for the war to end. The combination of the barnstormer's instinctive independence and the experience of volunteering for a war before his own country had joined it made him constitutionally incapable of acceptance. He began working on escape plans almost immediately. He joined tunnel teams, learning the cramped, claustrophobic work of digging through sandy soil beneath barracks floors while guards with microphones listened for the sound of earth moving. He participated in dispersing the dug soil, carrying it in specially made bags inside his trouser legs and releasing it slowly while walking across the compound, a technique known as penguining from the slightly stiff, waddling walk it produced. He was caught. He was caught more than once. Each time, the Germans threw him into solitary confinement, a small cell with minimal furniture, minimal light, and minimal human contact. The Germans noted his file. He was what they called a persistent escaper, a category that earned you no sympathy from the German administration and a certain amount of dark respect from your fellow prisoners. But it was not at Sagan that William Ashe performed the act that would make him genuinely legendary. That happened at a smaller camp in occupied France in a moment of absolute and breathtaking audacity. He had noticed the aircraft. That was the beginning of everything. The camp, or the transit facility he was being held at, was located close enough to a Luftwaffe operational airfield that the sound and sight of German aircraft were a constant presence. For most prisoners, this was simply part of the background of captivity, the grinding reminder that the war continued without them. For Ashe, who had spent his formative years with his head inside the cockpit of one aircraft or another, it was something else entirely. He watched the aircraft. He watched how they moved on the ground, how the pilots approached them, how the ground crews behaved around them. And he identified a target. The specific aircraft he targeted was a Messerschmitt, almost certainly a Me-108 Typhoon, a single-engine liaison and training aircraft rather than a frontline fighter. The Me-108 was used extensively by the Luftwaffe for transport, communication, and training duties. It was relatively simple in operation, fast, well-made, and entirely capable of flying a man from occupied France across the Channel to England. In the hands of someone who understood aircraft, it could be flown without detailed preparation. In the hands of someone who had spent his teenage years flying improvised machines with barely adequate instruments, it was an opportunity. The approach to the aircraft was the most dangerous part. Whether he had already effected a partial escape, whether he was part of a work party, whether he exploited a gap in perimeter security, the accounts suggest he reached the aircraft through some combination of disguise, distraction, and the simple brazen confidence of a man who had decided that hesitation was more dangerous than movement. He walked toward the aircraft. He did not run. Running attracted attention. Walking with purpose in the right direction, with the right body language, was something barnstormers understood intuitively. You owned the space you were in, or you gave yourself away. He walked to the Messerschmitt, reached it, climbed in. Here is where the years of irregular flying paid a specific and decisive dividend. A man trained entirely within the formal structures of military aviation might have climbed into that German cockpit and frozen. The labels were in German. The layout was unfamiliar. The procedures were different. Without a checklist, without a ground crew, without anyone to walk you through the sequence, a military aircraft could kill you before it even left the ground. But Ashe had spent his formative years in aircraft that often had no labels at all, or labels that bore no relationship to what the instrument actually did. He had learned to read an aircraft the way a mechanic reads a machine, by understanding what it needed to do, and working backward from that to what each control must accomplish. Throttle, mixture, ignition, trim. The fundamentals were the same in every piston aircraft ever built. The specifics varied, but the logic did not. He started the engine. The Daimler-Benz power plant caught and settled into its characteristic note, different from the Merlin he knew, but unmistakably an aircraft engine doing what aircraft engines do. He let it warm. He released the brakes. He began to move. What was happening on the airfield around him during these moments is difficult to reconstruct precisely. The account suggests that the aircraft's movement created confusion rather than immediate alarm. A moving Messerschmitt on a Luftwaffe airfield was not intrinsically suspicious if the movement was purposeful. The brief window between when the aircraft began to taxi and when someone on the ground understood what was actually happening was the only window Ashe needed. He got the aircraft to the runway. He pushed the throttle forward. The Messerschmitt accelerated down the strip and lifted into the French sky, climbed away from the field, and turned northwest in the direction of the English Channel and the country on the other side of it. He had no map. He had his sense of direction, his memory of the geography from his operational flying days, and the compass in the unfamiliar panel in front of him. The coast was roughly that way. England was roughly beyond it. If he could stay low enough to avoid detection, if the fuel was sufficient, if nothing mechanically failed, he might make it. He did not make it. The precise reason he was forced down before reaching England is not entirely clear. Accounts differ on whether he was intercepted by German fighters, whether fuel ran short, or whether mechanical difficulty intervened. What is not in dispute is that the flight ended on the wrong side of the channel and that Ash found himself a prisoner again, this time having stolen a German military aircraft and flown it over occupied territory, which elevated his status in the German record system considerably. The Germans were not amused. The punishment was severe. He went into solitary confinement again for a longer stretch than any of the previous times. The German authorities redoubled their classification of him as an extreme escape risk and began moving him to more secure facilities. A man who would steal an aircraft from an active airfield required a different level of containment than a man who dug tunnels or forged papers. They moved him north, then east, putting distance between him and the airfield he had already proven he could exploit. None of those facilities held him permanently. Through 1942 and 1943, Ash continued to make escape attempts with a consistency that bordered on compulsion. He went under fences, over fences, through drainage channels, inside carts, inside laundry bags, as part of elaborate staged diversions, and as a solo operator moving through the dark on nothing but instinct and memorized reconnaissance. Each time he was caught. Each time the Germans added another notation to his file and threw him back in a cell. The file grew thick, the solitary confinement periods grew longer, and still he tried. The question of why a man keeps doing something that keeps failing is interesting, and the answer in Ash's case was both practical and philosophical. The practical dimension was one shared by every dedicated escaper in the system. Every escape attempt, even a failed one, consumed German resources. Guards had to be detailed to search parties. Administrative time had to be spent on reports and transfers. Intelligence officers had to be diverted from other tasks. For a prisoner who understood that his job was still to fight, this was a meaningful contribution, even when the tunnel collapsed and the guards were waiting at the wire. The philosophical dimension was simpler and more personal. He had crossed a border before his own country went to war because he believed something was worth fighting for. Surrendering to the fact of captivity felt to him like a betrayal of that decision. He had not come to Europe to sit in a compound and wait. By the time he arrived at Stalag Luft III in its later phase, he was already a figure of considerable reputation among Allied prisoners. The story of the Messerschmitt had spread through the camp networks in the way that stories of audacious escapes always did, through whispered conversation in barracks, through the informal intelligence channels that prisoners maintained. The story improved slightly in the telling. The aircraft grew faster, the flight grew longer, but the core of it remained true and remained extraordinary. The man had walked onto a German airfield and flown away. At Sagan, he became involved in the tunnel operations that would culminate in the Great Escape of March 1944. The scope of that operation, the simultaneous existence of 3 large tunnels named Tom, Dick, and Harry, the industrial scale of the forgery and tailoring and intelligence operations that supported them, represented the high watermark of organized resistance within the German POW system. In the event, Ash did not get out through Harry on the night of March 24 to 25, 1944. The tunnel reached the surface slightly short of the tree line, and the slow pace of the escape meant that only 76 men had cleared the wire when the 77th man emerged into the snow and was spotted by a guard. The alarm went up. The aftermath was catastrophic. Of the 76 who got out, 73 were recaptured. Hitler, in a rage, ordered all of them shot. His own senior commanders argued him down to 50. 50 officers were murdered by the Gestapo, shot in small groups while their guards pretended they were being given a chance to relieve themselves by the roadside. It was a war crime of deliberate and cold calculation, and it marked a turning point in the character of captivity in the German system. Ash lost friends in those killings, but it did not stop him from continuing to attempt escape. This is, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible in its stubbornness. 50 officers had just been murdered for escaping. The lesson of the German response was explicit and final. Further attempts risked death. Ash continued anyway. He was moved again after Sagan, shuffled to more secure facilities where he had no knowledge of the terrain and no established relationships with fellow escapers. This was a reasonable security calculation that consistently underestimated the speed with which men like Ash rebuilt their networks in new locations. At each one, he resumed the same work. Observe the guards, map the perimeter, identify weaknesses, begin planning. The accumulated time. Ash spent in solitary confinement across his years of captivity runs to figures that are difficult to fully absorb. Weeks turning into months, in cells designed for isolation and deprivation, with minimal light, minimal company, minimal stimulation. This was a form of punishment that broke many men. It did not break him. He had found, inside the experience of solitary confinement, a form of mental discipline that strengthened the qualities that made him dangerous to his captors. He had time to think. He used it to plan. The liberation of the camps in the spring of 1945 was a disorganized, dangerous, chaotic process. In the east, some camps were force-marched westward in the dead of winter as the Soviet armies advanced, resulting in significant casualties from cold, exhaustion, and summary German violence. Ash survived it. He was liberated, returned to Allied lines, and eventually made his way back to Britain. He was 27 years old. He had been a prisoner of war for 3 years. He had made somewhere between 8 and 12 distinct escape attempts. He had spent more time in solitary confinement than almost any other Allied prisoner on record. He had stolen a German aircraft and flown it over occupied France. He had survived the aftermath of the Great Escape, the forced marches, and 3 years of continuous low-intensity war against his captors conducted from inside the wire. After the war, William Ash stayed in Britain. He went to Oxford, studied philosophy, and began the second act of a life that had already accumulated more material than most people see in a full lifetime. He became a writer. He worked for the BBC. He married a British woman and built a life in London that was, by external measure, entirely ordinary. He wrote plays and scripts. He lived quietly and with considerable humor about the distance between the drama of his wartime experience and the calm domesticity of his later decades. He did not talk about the escape attempts constantly. When he did talk about it, in interviews and eventually in the memoir he wrote in his 80s, he described it without heroics and with something that sounded genuinely close to self-deprecating wonder at his own younger self. He was 24 years old, he said at various points. He had made decisions that a 24-year-old makes, with the information a 24-year-old has, with the fearlessness that exists specifically in the human organism before it has accumulated enough experience to fully understand what it is risking. The barnstorming background mattered more than any official training, he maintained consistently. The years of flying machines that nobody had properly certified in conditions that no safety inspector had approved had taught him something the Luftwaffe could not account for when they parked their aircraft within sight of a man who thought the way he thought. He did not see a German military machine with German instruments and German procedures. He saw an aircraft. He saw something he knew how to operate from first principles, and he operated it. The Luftwaffe responded by doing what bureaucracies always do when confronted with something that should not have been possible. They added more security. They changed procedures. They ensured that aircraft were never again parked within practical reach of prisoners. What they could not do was produce a version of William Ash who would have looked at that Messerschmitt and thought about regulations instead of controls, about authority instead of altitude, about the consequences of failure instead of the possibility of escape. He died in London in 2014 at the age of 96. The obituaries mentioned the Messerschmitt. They mentioned Stalag Luft III. They mentioned the record of solitary confinements. They placed him in the broader context of Allied resistance within the German prison system and noted that he had been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most persistently disruptive prisoners in that system's history. What the obituaries mostly could not capture was the specific texture of the stubbornness, the quality of mind that made a man look at 3 years of failed escape attempts and draw from them not the conclusion that escape was impossible, but the conclusion that the next attempt would be better informed than the last. The record of failures is the record of a man conducting experiments. Each tunnel that collapsed, each wire that caught him, each guard that was in the wrong place at the wrong moment was data. He processed it and tried again. The stunt pilot from Tennessee, who had learned to fly before learning to be careful, who had volunteered for a war that was not yet his country's war, sat in German prison camps for 3 years, and fought the only war available to him. He did it with the tools he had, which were mainly a mechanical understanding of aircraft that transcended national markings and a tolerance for risk that his captors consistently failed to fully credit. He flew their plane out. That is the sentence that remains when everything else has been explained and contextualized and placed in its proper historical frame. In the middle of occupied France, in the middle of the worst war in human history, a 24-year-old kid from Tennessee walked onto a German airfield, got in their plane, and flew away. Not because he had permission, not because someone had planned it for him, because he looked at the aircraft, understood what it would take, weighed the odds the way a barnstormer weighs the odds, and decided that the wind was right and the moment was now. The Germans caught him. They always caught him eventually. But they never quite contained him, and there is a difference between catching a man and containing him that the Luftwaffe system spent 3 years learning at William Ash's insistence. You can put a man in a cell. You cannot put a man's judgment in a cell, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 flights in machines that should not have been trusted, the instinct for the gap in the fence, and the moment when the guard looked away and the engine was warm. He took all of that with him when they opened The Wire in 1945. He took it to Oxford and to the BBC and to his desk in London, where he wrote things down. He took it all the way to '96. And somewhere in the arc of it, in the distance between a county fair in Tennessee and a Messerschmitt lifting off a French runway into the summer air, there is something worth remembering about what a man can do when he decides that the rules governing his situation were written by someone else and do not have to apply. If you found this story as remarkable as we did, hit subscribe and come back next week. There is always another story the history books left somewhere near the back. The next one is on screen right now.